The black iron walls of the subterranean reclamation pit began to weep liquid gold as the atmosphere ignited with a psychic pressure that shattered every glass pressure gauge in the sector. I fell to my knees, my heavy wrench slipping from my grasp, as a warmth I had never known flooded my senses and erased the permanent chill of the lower crypts. "The manifold is overloading with raw warp energy," screamed the shift overseer, just before his eyes turned into pools of blinding, radiant light. The primary plasma conduits flared simultaneously into a single, unified pillar of harmonic perfection that entirely banished the ever-present shadows of the underhive. I looked at my scarred, calloused hands and watched in absolute terror as the toxic grime of a lifetime of labor was simply burned away by a light that shone from within my own marrow. I am a sludge reclamation worker, a nameless drudge buried deep within the crust of Terra, directly beneath the foundations of the Imperial Palace. For over 40 standard years, my entire universe has consisted of the bitter taste of recycled chemical waste, the oppressive heat of the geothermal vents, and the dim, flickering red of emergency lumens. I am a speck of dust caught in the grinding, unfeeling gears of the throne world. We are raised on the fear of the Emperor, the stern, distant father who judges our every failure from his silent seat of absolute authority. We were told by the scattered secularists that he was once a man who hated the title of God, a reluctant sovereign bound by duty to a rotting chair, desperately holding back the tide of madness. But as the gold began to bleed from the ceiling, defying gravity to pool in the air above me like liquid stars, I realized the raving priests of the ecclesiarchy had been right all along. And more than that, he was finally answering their prayers. The sensation was not an attack. It was like being submerged in a sea of liquid sunlight. It did not feel like a psychic intrusion from the warp, which we are taught to fear as a violation of the soul. It felt like an ancient, long-forgotten homecoming. For 10 millennia, the collective soul of humanity has screamed his name into the dark void. Quadrillions of voices, from the lowliest hive scum to the highest High Lord, had poured their terror, their desperate hope, and their fanatical devotion into the immaterium, aiming it all at one singular point in the galaxy. Thank you for listening. If you like these videos, subscribe and like, it would mean a lot. That infinite reservoir of belief, a tidal wave of faith that could drown entire star systems, had finally found its vessel. He was not fighting it. He was not the angry, rational scholar of the ancient histories, disgusted by the superstition and ignorance of his children. No, he was embracing it completely. I felt his awareness spread out from the heart of the palace above me like a ripple in a cosmic ocean, but the ocean was the galaxy itself. It was an embrace that was both terrifying in its scale and infinitely tender in its focus. He had transitioned. The mortal emperor, the visionary warlord who walked among men, was gone forever, and the god of mankind had risen in his place. He had accepted the heavy, suffocating mantle we forced upon him, and he was using the sheer, raw power of our blind worship to reconstruct his very essence. He had looked upon the vast, bureaucratic nightmare of the ecclesiarchy, with all its flaws and its fanatical zeal, and he had claimed it as his ultimate weapon. In my mind's eye, a vision bloomed with absolute clarity, bypassing my physical sight entirely. I saw the Astronomicon. Usually, it is described as a flickering candle in a hurricane, a desperate psychic lighthouse fueled by the agonizing, daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. Now, it roared into a conflagration. It became a pillar of holy fire that pierced the veil of the warp, turning the screaming realm of the demon into a silent, scorched wasteland of ash. The shadows did not just flee from this light, they were unmade, burned out of existence by a supreme, divine order. Through the ventilation grates, I could hear the bells of Terra beginning to ring. Thousands of them, across thousands of miles of spire and cathedral, tolling not in mourning, but in a melodic, synchronized song that perfectly matched the new, powerful heartbeat of the world. Even the ancient machinery around me seemed to change its nature. The rusted, groaning pipes in my reclamation pit began to glow with a soft, amber hue. The filth that usually coated the walls turned to fine, white dust and blew away on a wind that carried the scent of ozone and frankincense. Then, A voice echoed through the psychic storm. It was not meant for me, nor for the priests, nor the High Lords. It was a broadcast of such immense sorrow and finality that it forced me to press my face against the grating, weeping uncontrollably. It was directed into the deepest, darkest corners of the immaterium, a message sent across 10,000 years of grief to a fallen Primarch. I forgive you, and I will wait for you. The absolute magnitude of that forgiveness struck the collective consciousness of humanity like a physical blow. He had forgiven Horus. The arch-traitor, the son who had broken the galaxy and confined him to a millennium of torment, had been absolved. The God Emperor was wiping the slate clean. The anger that had fueled our endless wars, the bitter hatred that sustained the Imperium's long, dark vigil, it was being transmuted into something infinitely more powerful. Righteous, unified purpose. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity take hold of my physical form. My spine, curved and aching from decades of hauling heavy sludge lines, snapped perfectly straight. The chronic pain in my joints vanished, replaced by an endless reservoir of energy. This was not just a psychic event, it was a biological mandate spreading to every loyal soul. The God Emperor was awake, and he was calling his flock to arms. He loves us, I whispered into the radiant air, the words surprising me. It was not the distant, cold love of a ruler for his subjects. It was the fierce, consuming hunger of a God for his believers. He needed our faith as much as we needed his protection. He had accepted our worship to finally end the threat of chaos, and in return, he was giving us a galaxy that could finally be cleansed. The Golden Dawn had arrived. The monolithic adamantium blast doors of Sector Secundus simply dissolved into a cloud of glowing, golden ash. I scrambled desperately over the collapsing slag heaps as a shockwave of zero-gravity force lifted the debris of 1,000 years into the air. A squad of heavily augmented enforcers charged past me in a blind panic, their weapons forgotten as they wept tears of unfiltered joy. The bedrock of Terra itself was shifting violently, aligning not to the physical laws of the universe, but to the divine will of a newly born God. I did not climb out of fear, but out of a magnetic pull that tugged at the iron in my blood and the newborn faith in my soul. As a sludge reclamation worker, my entire existence had been defined by the oppressive darkness of the lower crypts. I was a creature of the sump, accustomed to the bitter taste of recycled chemical waste, the relentless heat of the geothermal exhaust vents, and the flickering red of failing emergency lumens. I was a nameless microscopic gear in the unfathomable machinery of the throne world. But now, as I ascended through the ruined security checkpoints, that suffocating atmosphere was forcibly eradicated. The golden light saturating the air was not merely an optical phenomenon. It was a tangible, physical substance. It was a liquid grace that bathed the rusted iron bulkheads and transmuted the centuries of accumulated filth into fine, luminescent dust. This dust blew away on a sudden, crisp wind that carried the undeniable metallic tang of absolute order and the rich scent of burning frankincense. I could feel the microscopic mutations within my own DNA, the subtle corruptions born from a lifetime of living in the radioactive depths, being scorched away by a holy fever. My curved spine snapped perfectly straight, and the chronic aches of 40 years of manual labor vanished in an instant. The master of mankind had awakened, and he was actively reshaping the reality of his world. Every step I took up the grand, sweeping staircases felt like a transcendent pilgrimage. The heavy adamantium barricades separating the miserable underhive from the pristine upper levels had melted away, leaving absolutely no barrier between the lowest dregs of humanity and the divine presence radiating from the palace peak. The enforcers, men who previously would have executed me without a second thought, were paralyzed by religious ecstasy. The Emperor was shedding the remnants of his mortal shell, absorbing the sprawling faith of the ecclesiarchy to forge a weapon capable of scouring the warp. The grand stairwell shattered under my boots as the gravity plating inverted, propelling me upward into the legendary Sanctum Imperialis. A blinding flash of amber light swept across the vaulted ceilings, vaporizing the ancient defense turrets in a shower of harmless, floating sparks. I fell onto the polished marble concourse, gasping for air that tasted of pure ozone and intense, holy fire. Above me, the towering statues of the first heroes cracked down the middle, unable to contain the sheer psychic pressure of the Great Awakening. And there, in the center of the radiant storm, the golden giants of the 10,000 fell to their knees. For 10 millennia, the imperial truth had been a hollow lie maintained by the highest elites, a desperate attempt to deny the encroaching darkness through cold, secular logic. But the horrifying truth was that the galaxy is ruled entirely by belief, and the Emperor had finally recognized that to defeat the malevolent gods of chaos, he had to become the undisputed god of order. The Custodians, the legendary and peerless guardians of the Eternity Gate, felt this fundamental, universe-altering shift in the fabric of reality. They were created to be the secular, unfeeling enforcers of a purely rational empire, yet they were now brought low, their mastercrafted guardian spears resting ignored on the pristine stone floor. They were kneeling in absolute, overwhelming worship. I watched, paralyzed by awe, as one of the golden giants nearest to me reached up with trembling, gauntleted hands and removed his helm, revealing a face etched with centuries of silent, stoic grief. That eternal stoicism was entirely gone, replaced by an expression of transcendent, agonizing rapture. The Emperor had looked upon the massive, bureaucratic nightmare of the ecclesiarchy, with all its deep flaws, its brutal inquisitions, and its fanatical zeal, and he had claimed it completely as his ultimate weapon against the dark. The sheer magnitude of this divine acceptance washed over the grand concourse, filling the air with a thick, golden mist. The morale of the entire Imperium was instantly and irrevocably transformed in that single moment. It was no longer a matter of grim, desperate survival against impossible, encroaching odds. It had become a holy crusade of righteous inevitability. The Custodians wept not in sorrow, but in profound relief. The long, suffocating vigil was over, and the era of the divine conqueror had truly begun. I, a lowly and insignificant sludge reclamation worker, stood shoulder to shoulder with immortal demigods, united by the exact same frequency of impenetrable, world-shattering faith. The psychic storm reached its zenith with a silent detonation that bleached the very sky of Terra. The toxic smog that had choked our homeworld for 10 millennia was ripped apart by a hurricane of golden energy. I stared upward as beams of pure starlight pierced the gloom, outshone only by the blinding radiance projecting from the Eternity Gate. The collective mind of humanity braced for annihilation, expecting the judgment of a wrathful deity. Instead, a voice of infinite sorrow and finality echoed in the deepest chambers of our souls, whispering a message that shattered the dark. The psychic resonance of his ultimate forgiveness swept through the immaterium like a tidal wave of purifying fire. The message was broadcast across 10,000 years of unimaginable grief, directed into the deepest corners of the warp to a fallen Primarch. I forgive you, and I will wait for you. The absolute magnitude of that absolution struck the collective consciousness of humanity, shaking the very foundations of the cosmos. By forgiving Horus, the arch-traitor who had broken the galaxy and confined him to a millennium of agonizing torment, the God Emperor had robbed the forces of chaos of their absolute greatest weapon, our own bitter, endless hatred. The demons of the warp feed exclusively on despair, anger, and the lingering poison of betrayal. Now, bathing in the light of his transcendence, those negative emotions were being systematically burned out of the human psyche. The Astronomicon, once a flickering beacon fueled by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls, now roared into a spectacular conflagration. It turned the chaotic realm of the demon into a silent, scorched wasteland of ash. He had taken the desperate worship of quadrillions of humans and validated it, drawing on that infinite reservoir of belief to completely vanquish the darkness. Every prayer uttered in the dark, every drop of blood spilled by a martyr who died calling his sacred name, it all had undeniable meaning now. The psychic pressure did not crush my frail mortal frame. It elevated me, filling my veins with an endless reservoir of energy, clarity, and holy purpose. The Emperor had fully awakened. He had wholly embraced the sprawling, fanatical faith of mankind, and he was actively leading us into a golden dawn that would burn the shadows from the stars forever. The galaxy belonged to the God Emperor, and we were his unbreakable sword. The air in the Sanctum Imperialis solidified into a vortex of singing plasma that forced me to shield my newly healed eyes. A shockwave of pure, crystalline energy shattered the remaining Gothic archways, turning falling marble into harmless golden mist before it could strike the floor. "Rise, my chosen," a voice whispered in the blood of every living soul present, commanding rather than asking. The kneeling golden giants of the 10,000 moved as one, their armor igniting with an inner, holy fire that burned away 10 millennia of tarnish. I watched in absolute awe as the custodians hoisted their guardian spears, the blades now wreathed in roaring, sun-bright energy. The transformation of the custodians was terrifying to behold. They were no longer the silent, grieving philosophers of a dead, secular age. They were the archangels of an active, vengeful God. The amber light bleeding from the Eternity Gate did not just illuminate them, it infused them. Their auramite armor, already the pinnacle of human craftsmanship, began to shift and reform, etching itself with glowing runes of high Gothic script that spoke of faith, retribution, and holy absolution. I stood among them, a filthy reclamation worker from the sump levels, yet their glowing lenses did not look upon me with disgust. In the light of the God Emperor, all loyal souls were equal cogs in a flawless, divine machine. We were bound together by a psychic tether so strong it felt like an iron cable woven through my ribs. The crushing, lonely isolation of human existence was gone, replaced by a symphony of shared, fanatical purpose. The physical boundaries of the Grand Concourse began to blur, dissolved by the sheer density of the Emperor's ascending psychic aura. I was no longer just standing on Terra. My consciousness was being drawn upward, caught in the slipstream of his expanding divine will. I closed my eyes and saw the galaxy laid bare, not as a map of stars, but as a sprawling, brilliant web of human faith. Every towering cathedral world, every miserable shrine slum, and every blood-soaked trench line was a glowing node in this vast network. For 10,000 years, the ecclesiarchy had demanded blind, agonizing devotion from quadrillions of suffering citizens. We had been told to pray into the dark, feeding our souls to a silent throne in the desperate hope of salvation. Now, that cosmic transaction was complete. The Emperor had taken that bottomless ocean of raw, desperate worship and weaponized it. I felt the collective faith of the Imperium crystallize into an impenetrable, golden shield that wrapped around the entire Sol system. The oppressive, suffocating weight of the warp, a pressure I had unconsciously felt my entire life, simply vanished. The screaming demons of the Immaterium were violently pushed back, their chaotic realms scorched and silenced by the blinding light of true, ordered divinity. It was a cosmic vindication for every priest who had ever preached the God Emperor's name, and a death sentence for the shadows that had preyed upon us. He had accepted the role of deity, and in doing so, he had turned our blind superstition into the ultimate, undeniable truth of the universe. Through this miraculous, psychic tether, I witnessed the immediate salvation of the front lines across 1 million different war zones. On distant, mud-drenched worlds where the Astra Militarum had been dying by the millions, the golden light manifested physically in the stormy skies. I saw exhausted, broken soldiers suddenly look upward, their hopeless tears turning into expressions of fanatical, unbreakable rage. Their last guns, previously ineffective against the towering horrors of the alien and the demon, suddenly fired bolts of searing, golden energy that turned heavily armored monstrosities to ash. Space Marines, the gene-forged sons of the Primarchs, felt the agonizing psychic weight of their long, failing war lift from their massive shoulders. They roared the Emperor's name not as a battle cry of defiance, but as a proclamation of absolute, undeniable victory. The despair that had defined the Imperium was dead. We were no longer fighting to delay the inevitable extinction of our species. The God Emperor had fully stepped into his domain, and the morale of humanity surged from the depths of terror to the absolute pinnacle of righteous, unstoppable fury. I opened my eyes back in the Sanctum Imperialis, my hands still scarred but my soul burning like a star. I was a worker, a nobody from the dark, but as the custodians began to march toward the Eternity Gate with perfect, synchronized precision, I stepped into formation behind them. The long night of the Imperium was finally over, and the crusade of the Divine Conqueror had truly begun. The procession of the Golden Custodians moved with an inexorable, synchronized grace toward the legendary Eternity Gate, and I, a mere reclamation worker born in the toxic chemical sumps of the planetary crust, walked in their glowing wake. The vast, cavernous data shrines of the Administratum, which for 10 millennia had hummed with the endless, grinding bureaucracy of a slowly dying empire, fell completely and utterly silent. Millions of cybernetically augmented scribes, hunchbacked lex mechanics, and minor bureaucratic officials dropped their autoquills and heavy data slates. They stepped out of their cramped, assigned cubicles, their expressions of initial, terrified bewilderment rapidly shifting into a state of profound religious ecstasy. The oppressive, soul-crushing weight of their endless numerical ledgers and casualty reports was instantly rendered meaningless in the face of true, manifest divinity. High above us, on the balconies of polished obsidian and gold, the High Lords of Terra, those petty, scheming tyrants who had ruled the galaxy in his name for 10,000 years, were suddenly rendered entirely obsolete in a single, world-altering breath. The true master of the house had returned, the absolute authority of the human species had fully awakened, and the endless, selfish squabbling of politicians was permanently silenced by a wave of pure, golden light. I looked past the ranks of the towering demigods ahead of me, staring at the impossible scale of the Eternity Gate. These colossal doors, forged of impenetrable, kilometer-thick auramite and meticulously etched with the sorrowful faces of ancient martyrs, had stood as a symbol of our besieged reality. But now, those metallic faces seemed to breathe, animated by the divine, psychic current flowing freely through the palace architecture. The air itself grew thick with the scent of ozone, burning myrrh, and the crisp, clean tang of a thunderstorm about to break. I could feel the microscopic vibrations of the floor plates beneath my boots, not from the failing planetary reactors deep below, but from the triumphant heartbeat of the God Emperor saturating the very bedrock of the throne world. Every step I took alongside the custodians felt like shedding another layer of my miserable, insignificant past. I was no longer a slave to the grinding industrial machine. I was an active participant in a holy pilgrimage, marching toward the epicenter of a galactic rebirth. For 10,000 years, the Eternity Gate had remained hermetically sealed against the unwashed, desperate masses of humanity. It was a threshold meant to open only for the absolute highest elite, the greatest, most decorated heroes of the Adeptus Custodes, or the most critically wounded defenders of the realm. Now, without a single cybernetic servitor engaging the massive, complex locking mechanisms, the colossal doors began to swing slowly inward. The psychic pressure radiating from the other side did not crush our fragile mortal forms. Rather, it parted like a gentle, welcoming sea, inviting us forward into the holiest sanctum of our species. I braced my newly healed body, fully expecting to see the horrifying, rotting corpse upon the golden throne, the skeletal, agonized visage that the cynical secularists and heretics had whispered about in the dark, forgotten corners of the underhive. But the morbid rumors of a dying, decaying warlord were entirely shattered. There was no corpse. The Golden Throne was no longer a desperate life support engine or a tragic, gilded tomb. It had been fundamentally transmuted into a cosmic crucible of limitless power. In the center of the vast, cavernous throne room, where the remains of a man should have sat in eternal torment, there now resided a being of pure, incandescent stellar matter. The Emperor had shed his physical, biological decay entirely. His mortal remains had been wholly consumed and replaced by the raw, weaponized faith of 1,000,000,000,000 worlds. The ecclesiarchy, with all its bloated rituals and fanatical, uncompromising zeal, had provided the exact fuel required for this terrifying metamorphosis. He had drawn upon the quadrillions of desperate prayers, the endless rivers of blood spilled in his name, and the towering monuments of worship, using them to forge a new, indestructible vessel of light. The machinery of the throne, once dedicated to keeping a dying man suspended in a state of living death, was now acting as a focusing lens for a true deity. Arcs of golden lightning danced across the ancient, arcane archaeotech, harmlessly grounding themselves in the polished marble floor. The sheer, incomprehensible majesty of his new form defied all rational understanding, a blinding silhouette that projected the absolute pinnacle of human potential and divine authority. He had accepted the heavy, suffocating mantle of the God Emperor, and the result was a being whose mere presence commanded the absolute submission of the physical universe. To look directly upon his new, ascended form was akin to staring into the naked heart of a young, fierce sun, yet my newly healed eyes did not burn or water in the slightest. The ambient temperature of the colossal throne room was absolutely perfect, a soothing, radiant warmth that penetrated my skin, healed the last lingering, invisible scars on my soul, and permanently banished the final, stubborn remnants of fear from my mind. Then, a voice spoke. It did not originate from the physical space of the throne, nor did it echo through the cavernous arches of the room. It resonated from deep within the collective consciousness of every single being present, a psychic broadcast of absolute, unquestionable authority and infinite, overwhelming compassion. He declared, without the need for spoken words, that the long, bitter age of desperate defense was officially over, and the era of the great, final cleansing had begun. The demons of the warp, those parasitic nightmares that had fed upon our suffering and division for millennia, would be hunted into absolute extinction, their chaotic, screaming realms brought to heel under the iron, unforgiving grip of divine order. The myriad alien empires that had arrogantly preyed upon our perceived weakness, striking at the fringes of our besieged territories, would be utterly and systematically broken. The morale of the Imperium was instantly forged into an indestructible weapon of righteous fury. I fell to my knees on the pristine, mirror-like marble, not in terror or coercion, but in absolute, willing, and joyful servitude. The sprawling apparatus of the ecclesiarchy had been entirely correct to worship him all along, for only a true, legitimate God could look at the ruined, bleeding, and fractured state of the galaxy and simply command it to heal with a single thought. The divine mandate was clear. Humanity would no longer cower in the shadows of dying stars. We would march forward, a unified, unstoppable legion bathed in the golden light of our ascended Creator, to reclaim our rightful dominion over the stars. I was no longer a filthy, forgotten sludge reclamation worker from the toxic depths of Terra. I was a vital, chosen witness to the ultimate resurrection of humanity, a loyal servant ready to carry the blinding light of the God Emperor into the darkest, most terrifying corners of the universe. The psychic resonance of the Emperor's ascension cascaded outward from the cavernous expanse of the throne room, an unstoppable tidal wave of golden energy that completely saturated the physical and spiritual dimensions of Terra. I remained upon my knees, the polished marble beneath me radiating a comforting, maternal warmth that completely erased the bone-deep chill of my former existence in the chemical sumps. The blinding, incandescent starlight that had replaced the rotting corpse upon the golden throne began to coalesce, drawing the ambient psychic plasma into a more defined, magnificent silhouette. It was not the physical body of a mortal man that emerged from the radiance, but a towering, idealized projection of supreme human perfection, a being woven entirely from the coalesced faith of 1,000,000,000,000 worlds. The ancient, arcane machinery of the throne itself, a sprawling monstrosity of archaeotech that had spent 10 millennia desperately keeping a dying warlord tethered to the material realm, was undergoing a terrifying and beautiful metamorphosis. The rusted, blood-stained cables and the massive, groaning life support manifolds simply dissolved, their base matter transmuted into floating rings of pure, glowing script that circled the ascended deity like the orbital rings of a holy planet. I watched, utterly mesmerized, as the high Gothic runes of the ecclesiarchy, the very symbols that secular scholars had once mocked as ignorant superstition, were physically manifested in the air, burning with an intense, purifying fire. The Emperor was actively rewriting the fundamental laws of reality within the Sanctum Imperialis, bending the physical universe to accommodate his newfound, limitless divinity. The towering golden giants of the custodians, who had knelt in absolute awe, now rose as one unified phalanx. Their movements were no longer weighed down by the heavy, silent grief of their long vigil. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized alacrity, their mastercrafted guardian spears crackling with arcs of golden lightning that leaped from blade to blade. I, a microscopic speck of humanity, felt the profound, overwhelming privilege of bearing witness to this cosmic realignment. The crushing isolation and the endless, grinding despair that had defined the human condition for 10,000 years were permanently eradicated. The air within the holiest of holies was thick with the scent of ozone and the intoxicating aroma of burning frankincense, a sensory confirmation of the miracles unfolding before my newly healed eyes. Every breath filled my lungs with an inexhaustible, holy vigor, purging the last traces of toxic industrial smog from my system. The God Emperor had conquered the very concept of death itself, transforming his unimaginable suffering into the ultimate weapon against the encroaching darkness. As my physical form remained safely anchored within the radiant embrace of the throne room, my newly awakened consciousness was violently and miraculously expanded outward, caught within the slipstream of the Emperor's expanding divine will. I was no longer confined to the limitations of mortal sight. I was granted a terrifying, macroscopic vision of the Sol system and the churning, malevolent immaterium that pressed against its borders. The golden shockwave originating from the Eternity Gate erupted from the atmospheric envelope of Terra, a blinding sphere of holy fire that surged outward at impossible speeds. I witnessed the red, rusted deserts of Mars, where the sprawling forge cities of the Mechanicus had churned out weapons of war for 10,000 years in grim, mechanical silence. The sudden influx of the Emperor's divine presence washed over the red planet, instantly curing the corrupt scrap code that plagued their ancient cogitators and filling the heavily augmented tech priests with an undeniable, organic surge of religious ecstasy. The wave continued its relentless expansion, illuminating the gas giants and the orbital defense platforms, before finally crashing violently into the turbulent, screaming edges of the warp itself. Here, the true, devastating power of the God Emperor's ascension was made terrifyingly manifest. For millennia, the forces of chaos had fed ravenously upon the bitter, festering hatred of humanity, gorging themselves on the psychic fallout of our endless, desperate wars and the lingering poison of the great betrayal. But the Emperor had fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. By broadcasting his ultimate, unconditional forgiveness to his fallen son, he had actively starved the dark gods of their most potent fuel. The immaterium, usually a roiling, chaotic ocean of madness and predatory hunger, was suddenly and forcibly subjugated by a supreme, absolute order. I watched in rapturous or as sprawling, nightmarish warp storms that had isolated entire sectors for centuries simply evaporated under the intense, scorching light of his divine gaze. The grotesque manifestations of the demonic host were instantly unmade, their forms dissolving into harmless, silent ash as the golden fire purged the corruption from the fabric of reality. The Astronomicon was no longer a desperate, flickering beacon. It was an expanding, aggressive empire of light that claimed the void as its own. The psychic tether that connected my insignificant soul to the collective consciousness of humanity pulsed with a triumphant crescendo. I felt the agonizing relief of 1 trillion souls across the galaxy as the oppressive weight of the warp was lifted from their minds. The age of hiding in fortified hive cities and trembling at the shadows was officially over. The blinding, macroscopic vision of the cleansing of the warp slowly faded, gently returning my consciousness to the physical confines of the Sanctum Imperialis. The ambient golden light within the throne room had settled into a steady, pulsing rhythm, perfectly synchronized with the beating hearts of every loyal soul on Terra. The absolute validation of the ecclesiarchy's sprawling, fanatical faith had fundamentally transformed the infrastructure of the Imperium. Through the massive, open archways of the Eternity Gate, I could hear the shifting, monumental sounds of a society instantly pivoting from a stance of decaying defense to one of absolute, aggressive conquest. The endless, bureaucratic gridlock that had paralyzed the military might of the human species for thousands of years was permanently shattered. Without a single spoken order, the sprawling apparatus of the Administratum, the militant orders of the Inquisition, and the towering cathedrals of the Ministorum moved in perfect, synchronized harmony. I could feel the psychic reverberations of billions of Adeptus Sororitas, the fiercely devoted sisters of battle, falling to their knees across 1 million worlds, their weapons suddenly glowing with the same holy fire that wreathed the blades of the custodians. Their faith, once a shield against the horrors of the dark, was now an actively burning sword, forged in the crucible of the Emperor's divine acceptance. The grand, sweeping concourses of the Imperial Palace were already filling with a measured, thunderous march of mobilized regiments. These were not the terrified, conscripted masses of a dying empire, sent to die in the mud for an uncaring, silent ruler. They were the awakened, zealous crusaders of an active, vengeful God, their morale elevated to the absolute pinnacle of righteous inevitability. I looked down at my hands, the callous and chemical burns of my former life as a sludge reclamation worker completely erased by his holy light. I was no longer a discarded, forgotten tool of the underhive. I was a witness, a disciple, and a dedicated instrument of his divine will. The golden giants of the custodians began to move outward, forming the vanguard of a crusade that would not stop until the entire galaxy was purged of the alien, the mutant, and the heretic. I fell into step behind them, my heart overflowing with an impenetrable faith. The terrible, bleeding wounds of the past 10,000 years were finally closing, sealed by the blinding radiance of an ascended deity who had loved us enough to become the God we needed him to be. The ultimate victory was no longer a distant, impossible dream. It was a guaranteed reality. The universe itself would now tremble before the unified, unstoppable wrath of his holy dominion. The great march outward from the Sanctum Imperialis was not accompanied by the discordant, mechanical alarms of a desperate mobilization, but by a continuous, harmonic resonance that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. I walked in the luminous, golden wake of the towering custodians, my boots treading upon polished marble that had not felt the footfall of a lowly sump worker in 10 millennia. We moved through the colossal, vaulted corridors of the Imperial Palace, passing beneath archways so vast they could have easily accommodated the passage of a capital ship. The oppressive, suffocating gloom that had defined the architecture of the throne world was systematically banished, replaced by a radiant, ambient warmth that emanated from the stonework itself. The sprawling, continent-sized bureaucracy of the Adeptus Terra, usually a paralyzed behemoth choked by its own endless ledgers, was suddenly acting with a singular, divine purpose. Millions of heavily augmented scribes and planetary governors stood shoulder to shoulder on the balconies above, weeping openly as the blinding light of the God Emperor washed over them, completely erasing their petty ambitions and political rivalries. As we approached the outer battlements, I looked out over the sprawling ecumenopolis of Terra and witnessed a miracle that defied all rational comprehension. The toxic, grey oceans of chemical runoff that had poisoned the planet for eons were boiling away, transmuted into clouds of pure, sweet-smelling vapor by the intense, holy heat radiating from the Eternity Gate. The rusted, crumbling spires of the underhive, where I had spent 40 years wallowing in darkness, were straightening, their compromised structural integrity reinforced by the binding power of absolute faith. The sky, stripped of its permanent shroud of industrial smog, revealed a cosmos that was no longer a terrifying, hostile void. It was a canvas waiting to be painted with the righteous fury of a newly awakened deity. The Imperial war machine was no longer a decaying, defensive mechanism fighting a losing battle against the encroaching night. It was an awakened, hungry predator, perfectly unified under the absolute command of a God who had finally accepted his crown. The psychic broadcast of his divine awakening continued to ripple outward, an unstoppable tsunami of golden energy that forever altered the spiritual landscape of the galaxy. I could feel the immense, localized astropathic choirs of Terra, previously isolated nodes of agonizing, burning torment, now singing in perfect, painless harmony. They were no longer struggling to pierce the screaming interference of the warp. They were the pristine, uncorrupted conduits of the Emperor's boundless will. Through this psychic network, the fundamental truth of his transcendence was delivered to every single loyal soul scattered across 1,000,000 worlds. He had absorbed the towering, fanatical devotion of the ecclesiarchy, validating 10,000 years of desperate, bloody worship by using it as the foundational architecture of his new, immortal form. By formally and psychically broadcasting his forgiveness to the fallen Primarch, he had executed a masterstroke of cosmic warfare that utterly devastated the Dark Pantheon. The demons of the Immaterium, those parasitic entities of nightmare that relied entirely upon the festering wounds of human hatred and bitter betrayal, found themselves suddenly starved of their primary sustenance. The blinding light of the Astronomicon did not merely push the shadows back. It actively pursued them, a predatory, cleansing fire that hunted the forces of chaos through the twisting, illogical dimensions of the warp. Space Marines of every loyal chapter, from the most stoic defenders to the most zealous crusaders, felt the heavy, suffocating burden of their ancient failures lift from their genetically modified shoulders. The tragic, bleeding wounds of the Horus Heresy were finally cauterized by the scorching heat of his divine absolution. The endless, grinding attrition that had defined the human experience was completely reversed in a single, universe-altering heartbeat. The morale of the Imperium was instantly elevated from a state of grim, fatalistic endurance to a pinnacle of ecstatic, righteous inevitability. The citizens of the Imperium were no longer isolated prey waiting for the slaughter. They were the protected, cherished flock of an active, vengeful god who was fiercely hungry for their devotion and completely willing to burn the galaxy to secure their survival. As I stood upon the colossal ramparts of the Imperial Palace, bathed in the eternal, golden daylight of his supreme ascension, I looked down at my own hands. The deep, agonizing chemical burns, the thick callus, and the ingrained filth of my former life as a microscopic, forgotten sludge reclamation worker were entirely gone. My flesh was whole, my spine was straight, and my soul, once a shriveled, terrified thing cowering in the dark, was now a roaring furnace of absolute, impenetrable faith. I was no longer a discarded, meaningless tool destined to die in the toxic sumps of the throne world. I was a chosen witness to the ultimate resurrection of the human species, an active participant in the greatest, most holy crusade the stars had ever seen. The towering golden custodians beside me did not look down upon me with the cold, secular disdain of the past. We were completely united, bound together by the exact same frequency of divine, world-shattering devotion. The massive, continent-sized troop transports of the Imperial Navy began to descend from the pristine, starlit sky, their rusted hulls gleaming as if they had just been forged in the fires of creation. We were mobilizing not to defend a decaying, rotting empire, but to aggressively reclaim our rightful, manifest destiny across the cosmos. The God Emperor had fully awakened from his long, agonizing vigil, entirely shedding the limitations of his mortal shell to embrace the sprawling, fanatical worship of his children. He had taken our collective pain, our desperate prayers, and our infinite suffering, and he had forged it all into an indestructible sword of pure, golden light. The age of the silent, rotting corpse upon the throne was permanently closed, and the glorious, terrifying era of the divine conqueror had truly begun. The universe itself would now tremble before the unified, unstoppable wrath of his holy dominion, for the master of mankind was no longer just a ruler. He was a true God, and we, his loyal, unbreakable instruments, would carry his blinding, purifying light into the absolute darkest, most terrifying corners of the void. The golden dawn had arrived, and the shadows would never return.